Hey there, fellow philosopher. Ready to dive into a concept that might sound a bit uh, like linguistic quicksand at first.
Oh.
Plural quantification.
Hmm.
Don't worry, though, we'll navigate it together.
It's funny how something so commonplace in our everyday speech,
Hmm.
like just how we talk, can end up sparking some seriously deep philosophical debates.
That's the beauty of philosophy, right?
Yes.
Unpacking those hidden complexities of seemingly simple things.
Absolutely.
So for starters, how would you explain this whole plural quantification thing to, say, a philosopher who's maybe never really encountered it before?
Well, let's start with a basic example,
Mm.
okay? Think about the difference between saying, like, there's a cat on the mat versus there are cats on the mat.
Okay.
The first one uses a singular quantifier, there's a, while the second one uses a plural quantifier, there are.
Right.
Seems simple enough, but traditional formal logic has mostly focused on the singular kind.
I can see why that would be tempting.
Yeah,
Singular quantifiers seem very neat and tidy. We can already do so much with them.
yeah.
But you're suggesting that by kind of ignoring these plural quantifiers, we might be missing out on some important insights.
Exactly. Philosophers like George Boulos have argued that treating plural quantifiers as like fundamental alongside the singular ones opens up a whole new world of expressive power.
Yeah.
It's like discovering a new logical tool that lets us capture nuances that we couldn't before.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give an example of where this extra power comes in handy.
Consider this sentence. Some critics admire only one another.
Go ahead.
Try to express that using only singular quantifiers, and you'll quickly find yourself hitting a wall.
Right.
It's known as the Geach-Kaplan sentence, and it's a classic example of how singular first-order logic just doesn't cut it in certain cases.
So we're not just talking about grammatical quirks here.
No.
This has real implications for how we formalize and analyze philosophical arguments.
Precisely,
Yeah.
and to handle these plural critters formally, we need a new set of tools.
Okay.
Boulos developed this formal language called PFO, short for plural first-order logic. It introduces plural variables like XX to represent some things,
Yes.
and a relation is one of symbolized by this little fishhook.
Oh, hold on. Let me wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, like, there exists an X such that X is a cat,
Right.
we could use these new tools to say something like, there are some things XX such that XX are cats.
You got it. And PFO also includes these powerful things called plural comprehension axioms, which allow us to define pluralities based on shared properties.
Okay.
For example, if we know there's at least one red apple, we can express in PFO that there are some things that are all and only the red apples.
Okay.
It's a way of formally capturing the idea that if certain individuals exist, then so does the plurality they compose.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Good.
But before we go any further, I have to ask, doesn't this start to sound a lot like second-order logic, where we quantify over predicates?
That's a sharp observation. It's a question that often comes up.
Yeah.
There are definitely similarities, but it's important to distinguish between the two. Predicates are like incomplete sentences with slots for objects. Plural noun phrases, on the other hand, are complete thoughts directly referring to specific things.
Right.
It's the difference between is red and the red apples.
Right. I see the distinction.
Yeah.
One is about a property, while the other is about the specific things that have that property.
Exactly.
But how does this play out in practice? I mean, in terms of the logic itself.
One way they differ is in how they handle modal contexts.
Yeah.
Statements about possibility and necessity, whether something falls under a concept can be contingent. For instance, you're a philosopher now, but you might not have been.
Right.
But belonging to a particular plurality seems different if we have the philosophers recording this podcast as our plurality.
Right.
You're definitely one of them right now, and that seems like a necessary truth given who's involved.
Right. So the very nature of what we're quantifying over seems to change the logical rules of the game.
Exactly. And this difference raises even more fascinating questions. For instance, can we have pluralities of pluralities, like groups of groups? That's what's called higher level plural quantification. And whether it's legitimate is a topic of debate.
Wow.
Some point to examples in languages like Icelandic, where they literally have words for things like pairs of pairs, suggesting it's not just a philosopher's fantasy.
Pairs of pairs. That's fascinating. It seems like ordinary language is offering up hints about these deeper logical structures.
Yeah.
But if we can have these higher levels of plural quantification, Does that lend weight to the claim that PFO is really just pure logic, like some argue?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's the crux of what's known as the logicality thesis.
Right.
And as you might expect, it's hotly debated.
Yeah.
The axioms and rules around singular quantification and identity are pretty uncontroversial.
No?
But those plural comprehension axioms with their implicit existential claims, well, that's where things get a bit more slippery.
I can imagine. After all, what counts as pure logic is a question that has occupied philosophers for centuries.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick up next time as we delve into the philosophical thick of it.
Okay.
We'll explore what makes something logical and how this debate about the nature of logic plays out in the context of plural quantification, so stay tuned.
All right, let's pick up where we left off last time we were grappling with this question of whether plural quantification, as embodied in PFO, can truly be considered pure logic. It seemed like a simple question, but I have a feeling things are about to get complicated.
You always did have a knack for sniffing out the philosophical rabbit holes.
Oh, thank you.
And this one is a doozy. You see, the debate about the logicality thesis, as it's called, is intimately tied to this even bigger question. What are the hallmarks of logic anyway? What makes something logical as opposed to, say, mathematical or metaphysical?
Okay, so we're going meta-logic, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm game. What are some of the criteria philosophers have come up with to try to pin down this elusive notion of logic?
Well, there are a few key contenders. Some argue that logic is all about topic neutrality. It shouldn't matter what we're talking about, apples, electrons, or abstract concepts. Logical truths should hold true regardless of the subject matter.
So logic is like a kind of universal solvent,
Yeah.
cutting through the specifics to reveal the underlying structure of reasoning.
Precisely. Others emphasize formality as a key feature of logic.
Okay.
It's not about the content of our thoughts, but about the form of our arguments, the way we connect premises to conclusions.
Right.
This is where all those symbols and rules come in, giving us a precise way to analyze and evaluate reasoning.
Right, like a set of blueprints for valid arguments, ensuring that our reasoning is sound no matter what we're reasoning about.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of ontological innocence.
Okay.
The thought is that logic shouldn't commit us to the existence of any particular kinds of things. It should be, in a sense, ontologically neutral, telling us about the relationships between concepts and propositions, but not dictating what kinds of things must exist in the world.
So no sneaky existential assumptions lurking in the shadows of our logical systems. That seems like a tall order, especially when we're dealing with something like plural quantification, which seems, at least on the surface, to be all about groups of things.
That's the rub. And this is where the debate about plural quantification gets really interesting. Those plural comprehension axioms, the ones that let us say things like, if there's a red apple, then there are some things that are all and only the red apples. Well, those start to look suspiciously like they're committing us to the existence of pluralities as distinct entities.
Okay, I see the problem. If those pluralities are real in some robust ontological sense, then PFO might be smuggling in some extra metaphysical baggage, which would undermine its claim to being pure logic.
Precisely. And this is where the debate about the ontological innocence of plural quantification really heats up. But before we dive into that philosophical free-for-all, let's take a step back and see how this debate about the logicality of PFO plays out in some other areas of philosophy. One place where it's particularly relevant is in discussions of logicism.
Ah, logicism. That ambitious project of trying to reduce mathematics to logic. I vaguely remember grappling with that in my undergrad days.
Right.
But how does plural quantification enter the picture?
Well, there are a few different flavors of logicism, and some are more amenable to plural quantification than others. For instance, there's neologicism, championed by philosophers like Bob Hale and Crispin Wright.
Okay.
They focus on something called Hume's principle, which essentially says that two concepts have the same number of instances if and only if there's a one-to-one correspondence between them.
Okay, that sounds pretty intuitive. Like if we have a group of apples and a group of oranges and we compare them up perfectly, one apple for each orange, then those two groups have the same number.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that you can actually derive a lot of arithmetic from just this principle. But there's a catch.
Oh.
Neologicists need the power of second-order logic, specifically the kind that lets them quantify over relations to make this work.
And I'm guessing that's where PFO might be able to lend a hand, providing that extra horsepower without having to commit to full-blown second-order logic.
Well, it's complicated. PFO on its own can handle what's called monadic second-order logic, which deals with properties of single objects. But neologicism needs the dyadic kind, which deals with relations between two objects.
Ah, so close, but not quite there yet. But wait, didn't you mention another flavor of logicism that might be a better fit for PFO?
Yes. There's sublogicism, which focuses on defining mathematical concepts in terms of a notion called the ancestral of a relation.
Okay.
Think of it this way. If parent of is the relation, then ancestor of is its ancestral. You can define the ancestral using only monadic second-order logic, which means PFO could potentially provide a solid foundation for this kind of logicism.
So PFO might not be able to single-handedly reduce all of mathematics to logic, but it could still play a significant role in certain logicist projects.
Indeed. And its potential applications don't stop there. Next time, we'll explore how plural quantification might offer a new way to think about sets, perhaps even offering a way to sidestep some of those pesky paradoxes that have plagued set theory.
Ooh, paradoxes. Now you're speaking my language. Can't wait to dive into that. All right, we've journeyed through the wilds of logicism, encountered the ancestral of relations, and now we're on the verge of confronting those notorious paradoxes of set theory. I'm sensing a climax approaching.
You're right to be excited. This is where things get really interesting and where the potential of plural quantification really shines through. Remember how we talked about those plural comprehension axioms, the ones that let us define pluralities based on shared properties? Well, those turn out to be surprisingly powerful when it comes to navigating the treacherous waters of set theory.
Okay, I'm all ears giving the lowdown on how plural quantification might help us avoid those set theoretic shipwrecks.
Well, let's start with the granddaddy of them all, Russell's paradox. You remember how it goes, right? The set of all sets that don't contain themselves. If it contains itself, it shouldn't, and if it doesn't, it should. A classic contradiction.
Oh, I remember it all too well. A philosophical head-scratcher for the ages. But how does plural quantification offer an escape hatch?
Instead of talking about a set of all sets that don't contain themselves, which leads to that nasty contradiction, we can rephrase it using plural quantification.
Yeah.
We can say something like, there are some things such that each one of them is a set that doesn't contain itself, and any set that doesn't contain itself is one of those things.
So we're shifting from talking about a set as a container to talking about a plurality of sets as individual things that share a certain property.
Exactly. We're still referring to the same collection, but we're expressing it in a way that avoids the problematic notion of that collection being a set itself. It's like saying the philosophers in this room, instead of trying to define some weird set of philosophers in this room.
That's a clever move. We're talking about the sets themselves in a plural way. We sidestep the need to create a set of those sets, thus avoiding the paradox. But doesn't this solution hinge on whether plural quantification is really as ontologically innocent as its proponents claim?
Yeah.
If those pluralities are just sets in disguise, then haven't we just swept the problem under the rug?
That's the crux of the matter, isn't it? And this brings us back to the heart of the debate about the ontological status of pluralities. It's a question that has divided philosophers, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
Well, let's lay out those arguments. What are the main lines of attack for and against the ontological innocence of plural quantification?
Those who defend the ontological innocence of plural quantification often appeal to our intuitions. They argue that when we use plural terms in ordinary language, we don't seem to be committing ourselves to the existence of some mysterious new entities over and above the individuals themselves.
I can see that. When I say the cats are on the mat, I'm not suggesting there's some extra entity called the cats floating around in addition to the individual felines.
Exactly. And they point out that plural quantification actually helps us avoid certain ontological commitments, like in the case of Russell's paradox. If pluralities were just sets in disguise, then we wouldn't have gained anything by using plural quantification to rephrase the problem.
Right. It would just be a linguistic sleight of hand, not a genuine solution.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the other side? What arguments do the critics of ontological innocence raise?
Their main line of attack is that plural terms, just like singular terms, seem to have semantic values. They refer to something. And if they refer, then whatever they refer to must exist, right?
So if the term the cat's on the mat refers to something, and that something isn't just the individual cats, then it must be some kind of plurality, a distinct entity over and above the cats themselves.
That's the argument. They argue that it's a mistake to try to get something for nothing, ontologically speaking. If plural quantification has real explanatory power, if it can do genuine philosophical work, then that power must come from somewhere. And that somewhere, they argue, is the existence of pluralities as real, albeit perhaps abstract entities.
Okay, so we have a standoff. On one hand, we have the appeal to intuition and the avoidance of paradoxes suggesting plural quantification doesn't commit us to anything new. On the other hand, we have the argument from semantic values suggesting that plural terms must be referring to something real. Are we doomed to philosophical gridlock?
Perhaps not. Some philosophers suggest that the entire debate might be a red herring. They argue that we're getting hung up on this loaded term, ontological commitment. Instead, they propose focusing on a theory's ideological commitments, the logical and conceptual resources it
It's
uses.
less about what exists and more about how we're thinking about things.
Exactly. The key questions become, does a theory employing plural quantification have more explanatory power? Does it help us clarify our understanding of logic and mathematics? Does it offer a more elegant and parsimonious account of certain phenomena? These are the kinds of questions that can move the debate forward even if we never definitively settle the ontological status of pluralities.
This whole deep dive has been a revelation. We started with something as seemingly mundane as plural nouns and ended up grappling with the nature of logic, the foundations of mathematics, and even the very structure of reality.
It just goes to show that philosophy can be found in the most unexpected places, and that even the most familiar aspects of our language can hide deep philosophical puzzles.
I couldn't agree more. It seems like every time we answer one question, 10 more pop up in its place. But that's what keeps philosophy exciting. So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway for our fellow philosophers who are just starting to wrap their heads around plural quantification?
I think the key is to recognize that this is a vibrant and ongoing debate. There are compelling arguments on both sides of the ontological innocence issue, and the implications of this debate extend far beyond the realm of formal logic, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of language, mathematics, and metaphysics.
It's a reminder that philosophy is not about finding definitive answers, but about carefully exploring the questions themselves and appreciating the nuances and complexities along the way. So to our listeners, keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep diving deep.